Hi, this is Carrala at carralaficklin.com, welcomenetwork.com, or if you wish you can just put welcome, and welcome is spelled W-Y-L-C-O-M-E, so you can either say welcome.com or welcomenetwork.com. istudyguides.com, istudycards.com, explain ASKPLAIN.com, and a lot of other sites that you can go to and find. Just go to one of their sites, and then the other sites you'll see, and you can click on, and they'll tell you what information is in which site. Okay, so today I would like to talk to you about language and about language learning. Not so much about a particular aspect, although I am going to do that, but as a way of looking at how one goes about learning a foreign language, or maybe even how does one go about learning better their own language. I think it's a normal tendency, at least for some of us, that when something is difficult or when something is complicated or hard, our first impulse is to move away from that thing or to avoid that thing. And I think it's understandable. Like I said, I think it's a natural impulse. But to be quite frank, I think it's a mistake. I think it's a big mistake, especially in the area of language. Because sometimes the very thing that we're trying to avoid saying, or the very grammatical, or the very, let's say, grammatical construction or structure that we are trying not to have in a sentence or in a conversation, keeps us from becoming native or fluent speakers. Now, probably if you're maybe after 7 years old, some people after 15, some people are very lucky that they can learn a language at 20 years old and learn to speak that language as fluently as they speak their own. But for us normal people, usually after 7, 8, 9 years old, if you learn another language, it's noticeable to the native speakers that that is not your language. Not so much for the vocabulary, not so much for the structure, but for the accent. I will always have an accent in French. I will always have an accent in Spanish. I'll always have an accent. So that is something that I don't think is avoidable for, as I said, us normal people who, after a certain age, when we learn a language, it's noticeable that it's not our language. But that doesn't mean that you can't speak the language well. Now, this is basically for English speakers, although it may apply to people of other languages. And I am talking about when an English speaker is learning a Latin-based language, or sometimes we call it a Romance language. There are a number of structures. There's not just one. There are a number of structures that, for us, extremely difficult. And maybe in this tape, I'll just give a general overview of why French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, languages that are very, very important, especially Spanish, because if you live in the United States is, I don't even know if I could say slowly, I think somewhat quickly, it's becoming a bilingual country. There's certain parts of the United States where if you don't speak Spanish, you can be lost. All right? And English speakers are going to have to accommodate themselves, just like other people have for decades been accommodating themselves to English speakers, that they have to learn another language. And in the case of the United States, Spanish. Not exclusively, because there's nothing wrong with learning Portuguese. There's nothing wrong with learning Italian. There's nothing wrong in learning French. But I think if you have to learn another language and you don't want to, but you feel that you have to, then I think Spanish is the language. So that's what I'm going to be basically talking about. And how, for an English speaker, there's certain aspects of Spanish that are difficult. One aspect which is not difficult, which is somewhat easy, much easier for an English speaker going to Spanish than for a Spanish speaker going to English, is pronunciation. Spanish pronunciation is rather consistent and regular. Now, you have to learn the correct sound of the vowels. And you have to learn that sometimes the sounds, not the opposite, but they're different. In English, the vowels are A, E, I, O, U. In Spanish, they are I, A, E, O, U. So sometimes when they say the I, it's not the I, and the E is not R-E, and the O, well, sometimes it's R-O, but sometimes it isn't. So that aspect is difficult, that we have to learn that when it's an O, it's an O, not sometimes an O, or sometimes an E, or sometimes an A. And if it looks like an English word, then we pronounce it more like English. Spanish is consistent. Much more consistent. I keep saying consistent. You know, no language is totally consistent, but much more than American, much more than, may I say American English? Maybe even British English. But there are aspects, let me put it this way. Sometimes we have to make a space in our brain for things in a language that our language doesn't have. Let me give you an example. In English, if you want to use the definite article, the indefinite article, the big problem, and a lot of English speakers don't even see this as a problem because they ignore it, is, does the word begin with a vowel or does it begin with a consonant? If it begins with a vowel, I'm talking about definite articles here. If it begins with a consonant, let me start with a consonant. The dog, the. Right? You have to learn how to pronounce that TH, but it's the. If it begins with a vowel, for example, apple, A, then it's the apple. Now, most people still say the apple because a lot of times people ignore that there's a difference between the and the. Same with the indefinite article a dog, an apple. There it's a little bit dicier if you ignore it. Okay. Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian. It's much more complicated. Oh yes, you can say the dog and the dogs. Now you can't say a dog and a dogs. If it's plural, then it's some. Right? As I said, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian. Much more complicated. They have, instead of just, let's say, 2 articles, depending on whether it's a vowel or consonant, they have many more. At least 4. At least 4. And I say at least 4 because you have to take in consideration not only if it's plural, dog, not only if it's singular, dog, or plural, dogs, but you're going to have to make a space in your brain and learn whether that noun, which is being modified, is feminine or masculine. That's hard for an English speaker who's not used to thinking or looking at an object or thinking about nouns, whether they're feminine or masculine. You can't avoid it. And saying it incorrectly, well, the next video we'll talk about saying it incorrectly. So this is Carrala Ficklin at carralaficklin.com and the other sites that I told you about in the beginning of the tape.